Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
Well, America 250 continues as we celebrate this year and are thankful, so thankful for this country and where we are, but we've got a lot of praying to do when it comes to the church and repenting and getting back to our biblical roots. But I've got an excellent guest to talk about some things that I think are really interesting, and that would be the great awakenings in our nation and two very important Georges. George Washington and George Whitefield. I've got Bill Federer, the website, AmericanMinute.com. AmericanMinute.com, tons of great books. And last time we had him on, we talked about the one about Islam, about the Quran. But so we're so thankful for his research and all the great work that he does. Bill, good to see you again, brother. Thanks for your time.
Oh, it's great to be with you, David.
Yeah, it's always good to have you on. And we talk a lot about history, and you're an expert in that field. And I learn a lot when I have you on. Our listeners do too. And this is an important year for America. A lot of nations, in fact, most nations don't make it 250 years. So America, in that respect, is also an exception, right? Not only how we were founded, but how long we've lasted. You want to comment on that before we talk about the Georges?
Yeah, I did a book called Who is the King in America? And I give a quick overview of all of recorded human history from the beginning of the invention of writing. And the most common form of government is gangs. And a gang leader with enough weapon we call a king, or a pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Czar. But power concentrates into the hands of one person. And if you are friends with him, you're more equal. If you're not friends with him, you're less equal. And if you're his enemy, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because with the latest military advancement, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon, iron weapon, phalanx spear that the Greeks had, scimitar sword the Muslims had, gunpowder that the Chinese invented. The weapon keeps improving, but it's that same fallen nature, Cain killing Abel. But by the time of America's founding, the King of England was the most powerful king on the planet. He was a globalist. The sun never set on the British Empire. And America's founders decided they didn't like globalists, and so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. And so a republic is where the people are king, ruling through representatives. And so republics have citizens. The word citizen is from Latin, which comes from the Greek word polities, which means co-ruler, co-sovereign, co-king. So republics have citizens. The word citizen means co-king. So America is an experiment of a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top-down, ruled by a king through fear, it's bottom-up, ruled by we, the people, government from the consent of the governed. Now, I get into this quite a bit in some of my books, like Silence Equals Consent, but the founders got some ideas from the Enlightenment, from the Magna Carta, from the Roman Republic and the Athenian democracy, but ultimately, it was ancient Israel. The first 400 years out of Egypt before Israel got a king. It's called the Hebrew Republic. And the Puritans studied the Hebrew Republic so much that they were nicknamed Christian Hebraists. And so they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. James Madison graduated from Princeton, and then he goes back for a year just to study Hebrew. And he wants to know about their political philosophy. And sure enough, James Madison is called the architect of our Constitution. And so this pre-King Saul part of the Bible, everybody's taught the law, and they have a 22-character alphabet, which is unique at the time. Egypt had 3,000 hieroglyphs, and only 1% of Egypt could read. Moses comes down the mountain with the law in a 22-character alphabet. So Israel is the first nation that is literate. So they have the law, they can read the law. It's the first nation with private property, because wherever there's a king, you never really own the property. It's always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. But in ancient Israel, the land was permanently titled to each family. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. And you can give away some of your stuff. The Bible called that charity. Every person left the gleanings of their field for the poor people to pick through. And everybody helped enforce the law. The verse we all have memorized is love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18. The verse right before it says, confront your neighbor directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. Right? So you're loving your neighbor and you're correcting your neighbor because there's no king, there's no police to call. It's just the people. It's sort of like a parent. You love your kid, but every now and then you got to correct him. And so in ancient Israel, you love your neighbor, but every now and then you got to correct him.
Yeah.
And then every man was in the militia, armed with a sword upon their thigh and ready at a moment's notice to defend their family and their community.
Yeah.
And so this Hebrew Republic was studied intently by the Puritans, and it was an alternative to a king. And so it was a bottom-up form of government where the people rule themselves in a covenant versus a king ruling top-down through fear.
Wow.
And so the word federal is Latin for covenant. So we have a bottom-up form of government that is drawn from originally ancient Israel. And so to this day, they have Hebrew characters on the coat of arms of Yale, truth and light. In 1685, part of the commencement address at Harvard was in the Hebrew language. They were studying Hebrew.
Wow.
And anyway, so America's unique in that we get to rule ourselves bottom up. And so in a sense, King Saul is the divider between England and America. You say, what? King Saul? Yeah, because the kings of England looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and after. And the Pilgrims and Puritans that founded New England looked to the pre-King Saul part of it. Both of them are looking to the Bible. One's looking to the after King Saul, divine right of kings. I'm the anointed one. I'm the royal gang leader. Do what I say or I'm going to cancel you. And the Pilgrims look to the before King Saul part of the Bible. Everybody taught the law, personally accountable to God to follow it. And
fascinating. So I appreciate you also connecting the verse about keeping your neighbor in check before it says love your neighbor. I appreciate those two verses in context. That's really important too. But I want to jump ahead now. I want to go back, Lord willing, time-wise, we'll talk about George Washington, some of his close calls, and the word providence. I looked up that definition in Webster's 1828 dictionary. It's fascinating, but I do want to talk to you, Bill, about the two great awakenings in the 1735 to 1743, roughly, and 1795 to 1830. But first of all, I'm assuming you saw the movie A Great Awakening, and I would just love to hear your thoughts on that picture overall, because it was, in my opinion, one of the best films I have seen. Go ahead and share your thoughts, please, because we want to talk about George Whitefield.
Yeah, I want to encourage everyone to go see the Great Awakening movie. It's tremendous. It does highlight the role of faith. It's interesting. George Whitefield and Ben Franklin and their relationship together. And so for those not familiar, every colony was started by a different Christian denomination. Virginia was Anglican. Massachusetts was Puritan. Rhode Island was Baptist. New York was Dutch Reformed. Connecticut, New Hampshire were Congregationalists. Delaware and New Jersey were originally Swedish Lutheran, then Dutch Reformed, then English. Maryland Catholic, and Pennsylvania Quaker. And they didn't get along, and they would tar and feather each other and chase each other out of each other's college. But then the revolution starts, and they all have to work together against the king. So this idea of working together really goes back to George Whitefield. The denominations would not get along. Matter of fact, in reading the history, if any one denomination thought they could have won the revolution on their own, they would have been tempted to make their denomination the national one. But because they needed each other, then after, when they were writing the Constitution, their fear was that this new federal government would follow the example of every country in Europe and pick one Christian denomination as the national one. So that's why they passed the First Amendment, to tie the federal government's hand to leave religion under each individual state's jurisdiction. And so I read through all the state constitutions, and 9 of the original 13, you had to be a Protestant Christian to hold state office, 3 just a plain Christian. But anyway, this idea of working together came from George Whitefield. So when he comes across, he is a new light, where the Puritans are now nicknamed Old Lights. They had a good covenant plan of government because the Puritans pioneered a covenant plan of government. But after a century, it got dry. It was just a plan. And they taught it academically at Yale and Harvard. And some said God has it so planned out that in his infinite wisdom, he already knows who's going to wind up in heaven. So don't even bother preaching the gospel. Whoever's supposed to get saved will get saved. And that's why they got nicknamed Old Lights. And so when George Whitefield comes over, he's the New Lights. He's like, no, it's more than a plan. Even if it's a good covenant plan, you have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life will change and you won't do worldly things anymore, like bars and brothels and government. So the devil won't leave any movement alone. He says to some, it's so personal, it's only personal. So that's where you eventually have the idea that churches have today is we're spiritual because we're not involved in politics. That came as a byproduct out of the First Great Awakening. But as far as working together, George Whitefield would give speeches and Ben Franklin records them.
Yep.
And he would stand on the courthouse steps and say, there's not an Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist in heaven. And everybody would say, what did you just say? And then he would finish the sentence and say that upon entering those gates, we don't lay aside our badges of schism and join together in worshiping our Savior Jesus. And they're like, oh, I get it. So we all have Jesus in common. And that help unite the colonies. And even Jefferson made a quote at this same similar time where he says, I allow the professors of religion to choose whatever route to heaven they think is the most direct, no matter which Christian denomination it is. So it's like, okay, so it's not all roads lead to heaven. It was the Christian roads lead to heaven. And but Ben Franklin, he is an interesting person. He was the 15th of 18 children, born in Massachusetts. He writes about growing up and reading his dad's books in the library that they had at his house. And he said most of the books were polemics, which means a written argument over doctrine. They were arguing over the Puritan doctrine and all the predestination stuff. And he said he found the predestination doctrine unintelligible, that, if God has it all planned out, then he would be unjust to condemn somebody to hell because, and so anyway, but he's going to a Presbyterian church in Philadelphia. No, I'm skipping ahead of myself.
Sure.
He's still there in Massachusetts when he's young. And he's working for his older brother James's printing shop. His brother James started the Hellfire Club, and he published articles against the Massachusetts governor, and he gets jailed for 4 weeks. And so Ben is just a teenager, and he keeps the little print shop going. And he writes editorials, and he uses a pseudonym, a fake name, Mrs. Silence Dogood. And so these were really, really good articles written by this Mrs. Silence Dogood, and he print them. And of course, his brother is finally gets out of jail, and he's like, "Wow, these are really good." And then when he finds out that his little, teenage, brother's been writing him, they get into an argument.
Yeah.
And Ben decides to run away at the age of 17, which is illegal because if he's been apprenticed to an employer, evidently that's a contract and you can't just leave. And so to break the contract, he has to leave the entire state of Massachusetts. So he goes to Philadelphia. He meets Deborah Reed. They fall in love, but he's a penniless young guy. And so the mom refuses to let him get married. The mom then has the daughter marry some ne'er-do-well guy who's got money, but he basically takes the inheritance and then wanders off and then dies, but nobody really knows that he dies. And his name is John Rogers, and he had another wife in London. And anyway, he runs away to the West Indies and gets killed in a fight. But since there's no record of his death, she can't get a legal, divorce or whatever. And so young Franklin says, well, he goes to England for a while and works over there in a print shop, but then he comes back and they can't legally get married, but they live together. And so that's Ben Franklin's wife, Deborah. At the age of 23, he starts publishing his Pennsylvania Gazette, and he publishes the first political cartoons. He publishes Poor Richard's Almanac, which sold 10,000 copies a year. And he invents the rocking chair, the Franklin stove, the bifocal glasses, swim fins. When you scuba dive, put those. That's a catheter, an odometer, a glass harmonica, which was like glass balls that were tuned, and a long-reaching device, sort of like with the clamps on the ends. And then he invented a lightning rod because the steeples of churches would get hit with lightning. But he found if you put a metal rod up higher and then run a metal cable to the ground. And so for that, he got honorary degrees at Yale and Harvard.
Wow.
He founded the first postal system, first fire department, first insurance company, a hospital, lending library, and the University of Pennsylvania. So George Whitefield preached in Pennsylvania, and Ben Franklin raised money to build an auditorium for him to preach in because he had been preaching outdoors because those old light churches wouldn't let him in. Mm-hmm. They thought he was too emotional. And so they were the stodgy, Puritans. And so he's preaching outdoors. Well, Ben Franklin helps to fund this building of the University of Pennsylvania. And then, it's the largest auditorium in Philadelphia. And then later it becomes the one of the early buildings of the University of Pennsylvania. Years ago, I went there and they had a statue of George Whitefield pointing to heaven and with his Bible. But during the woke period, I think they took that statue and hid it somewhere. Oh, sort of sad.
It is sad. Oh my goodness.
But Ben Franklin printed George Whitefield's sermons and distributed them up and down the colonies. And this helped spread the Great Awakening revival. A little about Franklin. At the Presbyterian Church, there was a New Light preacher, sort of like George Whitefield. His name was Samuel Hemphill, and he delivered really good biblical sermons, and the Old Light clergy did not like him. And so it was church politics. And Ben Franklin writes in his autobiography, the Presbyterians, Orthodox Presbyterian, disapproved his doctrine, but he says, I became his zealous partisan and contributed all I could to raise a party in his favor, and we combated him for a while with some hopes of success. There was much scribbling, pro and con, and they said he was an elegant preacher but a poor writer, so I lent him my pen and wrote for him 2 or 3 pamphlets and published them in the Pennsylvania Gazette. And so these were really scriptural ones, a vindication of the Reverend, dialogue between 2 Presbyterians. And then he prints ones where it says, Christ gave himself for us that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify to himself a particular people zealous for good works. And one should acknowledge Jesus Christ to be the Messiah promised by the prophets, the Son of God. So here's Franklin writing these things that are very scriptural. And then when the Samuel Hemphill gets voted out, he drops out of church. And he ceased attending, though he continued to financially support the First Presbyterian Church there. So he said in his Pennsylvania Gazette, being frequently censored and condemned by different persons for printing things which they said ought not to be printed, I have sometimes thought it might be necessary to make a standing apology for myself and publish once a year. And so he said, I'd been educated a Presbyterian, and though some of the dogmas of that persuasion, such as eternal decrees of God, election, retrobation, appeared to be unintelligible to me, I early absented myself from public assemblies. And then he said that the new pastor came and visited him and talked him into going back. And he said, I did 5 weeks in a row, 5 Sundays successively. Had he been, in my opinion, a good preacher, perhaps I might have continued, but his discourses were chiefly either polemic arguments or explanations of the peculiar doctrines of our sect, and were all to me very dry, uninteresting, and unedifying, and I attended his preaching no more. My conduct might be blamable, but I leave it without attempting further to excuse it. And so here's Franklin. John Adams said the Catholics thought him almost Catholic. The Church of England claimed him as one of them. The Presbyterians thought him half Presbyterian. The Friends believed him to be a Quaker. And so there was during the First Great Awakening is the period of the French and Indian War. Mm-hmm. And then Ben Franklin raises a militia, which was a big deal because since Pennsylvania was Quaker, they were nonviolent, and they realized, well, we couldn't force people to join the militia. And so he made it a voluntary militia, and 10,000 guys volunteer.
Wow.
And this catapults him to statewide fame, so to speak. And then, believe it or not, he proposes a general fast, and he publishes it in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and it gets passed by the legislature. December 12th, 1747, we have thought fit to appoint a day of fasting and prayer, exhorting all, both ministers and people, to join in fervent supplications that Almighty God would mercifully interpose and still the rage of war and put a stop to the effusion of Christian blood. He publishes other famous conservative authors like Reverend Alexander Craighill, and then lots of other ones, but the ones with George Whitefield are the dearest. So he talks about attending his meetings, counts as best he could an estimated 25,000 in attendance. He writes in his autobiography of Whitefield's revival, "It was wonderful to see the change made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless and indifferent about religion, it seemed as if the whole world were growing religious. So one could not walk through the streets of town in every evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street."
Wow.
And Franklin writes to George Whitefield, 1752, "My dear doctor, I find that you grow more and more famous in the learned world." And then Franklin writes to, that was Whitefield writing to Franklin, saying, "Dear Dr. Franklin, I found you growing more famous." And then Franklin writes to Whitefield and says, "I sometimes wish you and I were jointly employed by the Crown to settle a colony on the Ohio, a strong body of religious and industrious people. Might it not greatly facilitate the introduction of pure religion among the heathen if we could, by such a colony, show them a better sample of Christians than they commonly see in our Indian traders?" Because the people that would trade with the Indians would shice them and all the time. But here's Franklin writing to arguably the Billy Graham of the day,
Right,
saying, "It would be great if you and I could start it. Then we could really show these Indians what Christians are like." Franklin writes in 1764 to Whitefield, saying, "Your frequent repeated wishes and prayers for my eternal as well as temporal happiness are very obliging. I can only thank you for them and offer you mine in return." So sure enough, Whitefield's, witnessing to him in his letters. Whitefield's last surviving letter to Franklin, he shared his desire for both he and Franklin would, quote, "be in that happy number of those who in the midst of a tremendous final blaze shall cry amen." And then Franklin writes his proposals relating to the education of youth in Pennsylvania. "History will afford the frequent opportunities of showing the necessity of a public religion. From its usefulness to the public, the advantage of a religious character among private persons, and the excellency of the Christian religion above all others, ancient and modern." So, but he go ahead.
That's interesting to hear that. What you're sharing, some of these quotes, I'm thinking about the movie. I'm thinking about what my past understanding of Ben Franklin was, and it just seems like he was more religious, more pro-Christian, biblical worldview than I've heard in the past, or even was depicted in the movie A Great Awakening.
Yeah. He would, he really got turned off by the religious arguments between denominations. And he didn't like just preaching on doctrine without good works, without people going out and living like a Christian and helping the poor, because he was always into starting, hospitals and things like that. He said that our religion needs to be more than, here's one. This is what Franklin writes to Joseph Huey, June 6, 1753. "The worship of God is a duty. The hearing and reading of sermons may be useful, but if men rest in hearing and praying, as too many do, it is as if a tree should value itself on being watered and putting forth leaves, though it never produces any fruit." So if you just go to church and you hear sermons, but you don't live as a Christian, and so that what turned him off. When he laid the cornerstone of the Pennsylvania hospital, which was considered the first hospital in America, he composed the cornerstone text. In the year of Christ, 1755, this building, by the bounty of the government and of many private persons, was piously founded for the relief of the sick and miserable. May the God of mercies bless the undertaking. And then he writes a pamphlet to people in England who are thinking about coming to America. It's called Information to Those Who Would Remove to America, 1754. Saying, in America, atheism is unknown there, infidelity rare and secret, so that persons may live to a great age in that country without having their piety shocked by meeting either an atheist or an infidel. And the divine being seems pleased to favor the whole country. And then, as you mentioned, he called for prayer at the Constitutional Convention. One of the interesting things that people may not be aware of is he's the first governor of the state of Pennsylvania. And he introduces into the Constitution Section 10. This is September 28th of 1776. And each member, before he takes his seat, shall make the following declaration. I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good, the punisher of the wicked. And I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration.
Wow.
And no further or other religious test shall ever hereafter be required of any civil officer. But I mean, here, but if you look at it, by saying all you got to do is believe in God and the scriptures being inspired, you could be a Catholic or a Protestant and say, yeah, I believe the scriptures are inspired. Right? I believe that there's a God. And so that was very, where many of the other states, like South Carolina, said you had to be a Protestant Christian. South Carolina's original state constitution said the Christian Protestant religion is hereby deemed the established religion of this state. People say, well, if America was Christian, why didn't they establish it Christian? Well, South Carolina did, right? Other different states did, because religion was under states' jurisdiction. And many of them, you couldn't even hold office unless you were a Christian. But it was the states that sent delegates to compose the federal constitution.
Bill, we need to have you back sometime and talk about the second biggest lie in America, the separation of church and state. We need to do a podcast about that, because we've come so far as the church and our lack of understanding of our influence and our role and responsibility in this country, in this nation. But thank you so much for all you do. Again, I want to give the website AmericanMinute.com. Lord willing, we will have you back soon, Bill, and talk about some of these other things as well. We appreciate your time, brother.
Well, thank you. One last trivia. Franklin signed the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, which started off in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Get that, 1783. But thank you for having me on. It's a tremendous honor, David.
You're most welcome. God bless you, brother. All right, friends, thanks. Share this one. A lot of history, a lot of great quotes shared. And we appreciate you guys praying for us as well. God bless you. And as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter. See you next time.